Now we're moving on to Ian Goldin, who's the director of the James Martin 21st Century School at Oxford University, also the author of a new book, Exceptional People, How Migration Shaped Our World and Will Define Our Future. Dalia obviously brought up human capital. This is going to be a lengthier discussion of the same subject, I think.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks for not only inviting me, but giving me the opportunity to address a subject which was not discussed at Bretton Woods, unfortunately, which is an orphan of economic institutional design and is a very neglected child of economics. And that is, of course, the question of the international flow of people, migration. I will talk tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, for those of you that can face that time of the day, about the issues as they relate particularly to the design of current institutions and the financial markets. But what I want to focus on today is the question of migration and make the argument why we need an institution for migration, why this is indeed a neglected issue on both the economic analysis front and the sovereign institutional front and international institution front. Now, it's something of a puzzle when one looks back at the great classical economists, Smith, Mill, and others, because they, of course, were passionate about labor issues. They were passionate about the need for free flow of labor, not only because they saw that as essential to economic growth and development and labor markets, but also because of the intrinsic human rights associated with this. Interestingly enough, that although through the age of mass migration, which Hutton and Williamson have written so eloquently about, when 30% of Italy, for example, migrated, 30% of Scandinavia, mass movements of people that not least created the dynamism in the US. At a time when wage rates were about 1 to 4 in ratios, now about 10 times that. As this moved towards the end of the 19th century and into the neoclassical period, and passports came into being and controls came into being, the neoclassicists and their disciples today have been remarkably silent about this issue of labor migration. And it's something of an irony that the classical people talked about it so passionately in a time of free migration, and the neoclassical economists are silent about it in an age which has never been more restricted in terms of labor movement. And when one tries to understand this puzzle, it's very important to ask the question, what is the role of migration in economics? And is this simply a human rights issue, or is this something which goes much deeper? And I argue very strongly in the book that it is a deep end, that in fact it's the most important factor driving economic growth and dynamism of economies, and that we neglect this at our peril going forward. So very small changes in migration flows lead to very significant increases in welfare. So 1% increase in flows, at least 100 billion in welfare gains. The question, of course, is the distribution of these gains, and many of these flow to the countries that the migrants are coming from. This is over and above the remittance flows, which, of course, are already about $350 billion a year, 4, 5, 6 times aid flows, depending on how one measures those. Now, what isn't included in a lot of this analysis is, of course, the dynamic story, and that is so important. It is trying to understand why it is that 40% of the patents in the US are taken by migrants, although they're only around 12% of the population. 50% of the Silicon Valley startups, 25% of all the US tech and engineering startups in the period 95 to 2005. And of course, if you understand the dynamics around who migrates, and then Nobel Prize winners in the room who themselves are ancestor migrants, you begin to understand the risk-taking, the innovation, and the dynamism associated with that. But the story shouldn't stop there, because it's not only a question of the dynamism of these individuals. It's a question, of course, of how they meet the needs of labour markets in the societies they're going forward to. And of course, we need to consider very deeply the impact on the societies they're leaving. Do they, by leaving, undermine the economic potential of the emerging markets? What about the brain drain? And not only that, in terms of activity, in economic sense, but also in terms of political dynamism. When your rebels leave, do you slow down the potential for political change, and what is the political economy of that? The evidence does suggest that one can argue for a win-win-win analysis, where both the sending countries, the receiving countries, and the migrants themselves benefit very strongly. But that does depend on the policy assumptions that one makes, and of course, the particular cases. Now, looking forward, the case will become even more compelling. Assuming that entry and exit from labour forces remains roughly at the age as it is now, and I think, of course, that's an assumption we will have to throw out the window, the rich country labour force goes down from about 800 to 600 million over the next 40 years. This is both because of the longevity projections, and the good news about this session is, however bad it is, your life expectancy is going to increase by more than this time while you're here at Bretton Woods. So your life expectancy should increase by about 4 hours while you're here over these 2 days. But that's the pace of longevity improvements. Associated with that, of course, is another dramatic story, which is of fertility decline. So fertility way below replacement level in all countries of the world except Africa. You put these things together and you get this huge deficit and the need for migrants not only to create the dynamism of economies, but of course from a fiscal and from a pension and a healthcare point of view. So there are multiple different dimensions to this, and one needs to go into a great deal of detail on them. One needs to also understand how, as societies emerge over the migration hump, although that is a contested theory, the level of migration will increase, and as inequality increases, because migration is correlated with equality and inequality, it's likely to increase at all. But as the sending countries go through an even more dramatic change than the receiving countries, it's very likely that there will not only be the war on talent that's just been talked of, but actually a war not only for very talented but untalented people too, the people that we want to push us around in our wheelchairs and to clean our streets. So this is going to, I think, make the discussions of today seem redundant in the future. In other words, we'll be moving to a world in which, once again, like in the 19th century, the leading politicians and actors are thinking deeply about how to attract people to their shores, how to keep them, and that becomes a much bigger story. This will require, as we go forward, an institutional structure at the global level. It's very important to recognize that because migration is an orphan structure, there are many basic things like the portability of pensions, like the ability to move between different jurisdictions and maintain voting rights, which are not there. So we live in a global age that's almost become a trite statement of this mass transnationalism where we have multiple identities, but there's absolutely no system for it. So it's the missing piece from Bretton Woods, and my hope as we talk about Bretton Woods 2 is that Bretton Woods 2 includes something which is very strong on migration. Now, what would this involve? I think the vision is rather like that of GATT and WTO. In other words, it's the aim to find a progressive realization of free movement of labor. And I don't think anyone would be that politically naive, as they certainly haven't been on trade, to imagine this could be achieved overnight. But it's not only an ambition which is shared globally, it's the realization in practice that there's a lot of information and research which is required to understand how this can best be done. The data on migration is almost as weak as the global policy environment. There's no equivalent of the sorts of things we have on trade or capital. So every country has its own definitions of migration, and there's no global data set or anything close to it on that. And certainly the sending and receiving numbers don't begin to add up. The research agenda on migration is, of course, also extremely significant. It really is a reflection on where economics has got to. that this whole vital area is so deeply neglected. There's virtually no work at all on dynamic gains from migration, very small pockets on static gains, a handful of really great economists who think about this issue systematically. So when you look at issues like the wage effect, the fiscal effect, and many other dimensions, the relationship to endogenous growth and innovation, there are very few people one can turn to. This was not always so, as I've indicated, and many economists that we know, like Galbraith, who of course always talked about it as the oldest action against poverty, and Kindleberger, who bemoaned the very deeply narrow nature of economics and the need, of mankind and people, and the need for economists to extirpate the primitive instincts and teach cosmopolitanism. There are many people who've pushed this, but it's not reflected in our current structure of economic teaching, analysis, or institutional design thinking. So as we go forward and think about the future of the global commons management and accept that superconnectivity requires a complete rethinking of institutional design, we have this irony that finance, which is the most studied of all the global flows, is in deep crisis. There are more people thinking about it and more financial economists that are focused on this issue, and yet we were all perplexed and look for the solutions here at INET. And we have migration, which is the least studied of all the flows, with no institutional structures equivalent to the IMF, the BIS, or the central banks, or anything else. And the question is, which stands a better chance of therefore getting somewhere? Is it easier to reform in an existing structure, or is it better to start afresh? And I think both are extremely difficult. But there's certainly a case in which the existing institutions on finance have this tremendous legacy and politics built into them, which means that to do radical reform of the institutions, and that's indeed what's required, one has to throw out a tremendous amount of vested interest and ideology and history in our economic thinking. Not history in the deep sense, but history in the short-term sense of what we've been taught in our economics classes. And as we try and do that, and think about the sorts of discussions that are going on about, for example, IMF reform, there is a sense in which these marginal changes to the great institutions that were created at Bretton Woods are like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. They are so marginal to the need for radical solution that they are, if they pursued, unlikely and might even well divert attention from the need of really strong reform of these institutions, which is required to deal with the levels of complexity, as others have said, the depth of the need for better understanding of economics. And very small reforms, on the other hand, within the migration world, could lead to very, very significant changes. It could be that a very small global structure, a lightweight structure, which just try to apply some of the treaties that try to develop a global database and try to move forward a progressive agenda on migration, would lead to a very significant long-term consequence. These are not choices. We need to do both. In order for the dynamism of our economies and sustainability in the challenging years ahead, we need to ensure that we can both reform the existing institutions and be up to the task of creating new ones. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian.